Well, we're still in Colorado.
We are.
Well, we're not, but I mean, we were there.
We were.
We were at the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives.
Right.
On the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad. And this week we're going to be featuring some of the other locomotives that were there.
Right.
I love this area right here. We're just heading up toward the summit at Cumbres Pass.
Gee, put your oxygen on.
It's the trees look small up here because they don't thrive at this elevation. So these 5 locomotives are the stars of the show, and the 3 toward the back there are the ones that we're going to be looking at this week. They're the more modern engines. Don't they look modern to you?
Yes, very.
They're still 19th century, barely, the last of them being built in 1899. Now these are the 2 locomotives we've already looked at.
Right.
Both built in 1875. And they are so much older looking than the other ones to say that they're only 10 years older.
Right.
Now this super modern engine here is built in 1895, making it just 20 years newer than those other 2 locomotives. Well, look at the changes. And one of the most extreme changes is just how powerful this locomotive is.
Yes, it's also bigger.
It's bigger, and look at the string of cars it's pulling.
Right.
And it's not having any trouble with it.
Nope.
Now these were much more powerful locomotives than the wood-burning engines of 1875. Now this locomotive is much better known as Denver and Rio Grande Western 315. But it was repainted back to an earlier paint job just for this event. Now, while all this was going on, they were still running the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad.
Yes.
And they run these much larger Mikado engines. There were 3 of them operating out of the facility the whole time we were chasing around the smaller, earlier locomotives.
I'd waited for hours for this particular shot.
Wow, the light's spectacular.
Yes, Mother Nature put on a spectacular show for these trains.
Boy, on more than one occasion, too.
Yes.
We had a little bit of rain and some beautiful sunsets, but just an absolutely gorgeous weather. So these 3 locomotives spent the bulk of the time shuttling around, hustling around the shops here at Antineto.
Right.
There's a lot of maintenance that goes on with a steam locomotive, but I think a lot of what they were doing too was just putting on a good show for the people.
Yes, they were.
So we got to see the engines running around light and coupled together as well. So as we were saying, this locomotive is probably better known as Denver and Rio Grande 315, Consolidation locomotive. But when it was first built in 1895, it operated on the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad.
Right.
Just a small railroad near here, and then was sold to the Rio Grande, the Denver and Rio Grande, before it became the Denver and Rio Grande Western, and they numbered it 425. And later on, after they became the Denver and Rio Grande Western and opened up their line to Salt Lake City, they renumbered it as number 315.
I see.
Anyway, the Rio Grande chose to retire the locomotive in 1949.
Oh.
And fortunately, unlike most of these engines, it was not scrapped.
Thank goodness.
It was given to the city of Durango. And since the Rio Grande was operating their Scenic railroad out of there, it made sense to maybe have one of their earlier engines on display in the public park. So that's exactly what they did. They put this locomotive on display in a public park. There's a very interesting wooden locomotive parked there now.
Yes.
But that's definitely a subject for maybe later in the show, because it's a recreation of one of the other engines here that was made as a movie prop out of wood. I digress. But this locomotive was put on display in the public park there in Durango. Anyway, it was pulled out of the park in 1998 and given over to the Durango Railroad Historical Society, who said that they wanted to restore and rebuild it to operating condition and perhaps run it there on the Durango and Silverton. They weren't able to finish it until 2007, and then found that they're really not all that welcome to run it on the Durango and Silverton.
Oh, no.
Well, it's a scenic railroad, and it's
yeah.
a for-profit thing,
Yep.
and they really didn't want to have some group of volunteers running their locomotive and getting in the way. So after they ran it over there a few times, they relocated it over here to the Cumbres in Toltec.
I see.
Anyway, for the event here, they've repainted it and backdated it to its earlier version and given it the number 425. Since this is the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives, they wanted to make it look as it did when it was built. Now here's another locomotive here at the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives, Denver Rio Grande 168, a T12 locomotive, a passenger locomotive, T12 meaning that it's a 10-wheeler, a 460, and it was built in 1883.
Wow.
So it's about 10 years older than the other engine and only about 8 years newer than the Eureka and the Glenbrook.
Really? Wow.
But what a beautiful, I just love 10-wheelers.
They're neat.
They're just absolutely gorgeous engines. I love the configuration. And this has very tall drivers as narrow gauge. These were the largest drivers on the Rio Grande.
Right.
And a very fast locomotive as Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge standards went. Not all that fast, but still quite quick for this railroad. And there they are, 46-inch drivers.
Goodness.
Now compared to something like the big boy, that's tiny.
Right.
But for the Denver and Rio Grande, a 46-inch driver is just huge. And that means it was a very fast locomotive. Anyway, here again, the locomotive was saved from being scrapped, and it was given to the city of Colorado Springs to display in a park. And it sat there for a number of years where surprisingly it wasn't vandalized or the elements really didn't destroy it or anything.
That's amazing.
Anyway, the locomotive was given to the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad,
Right.
For restoration and to use just on special events and small charter trains and that sort of thing. Now, this is not part of the Gathering of Victorian, but it's an interesting locomotive anyway.
Right. It was in there hiding in the shadows.
It
So
was
we
hiding.
grabbed the picture of it.
We couldn't resist. It's a K27 Mud Hen.
A mud hen?
A mud hen was the nickname for these things, and this was the first of the big Mikados that the Denver and Rio Grande Western ran. It's a huge locomotive compared to the other ones, but it's the smallest of the Mikados. And this one was restored. They blew a side rod off of it years ago. Anyway, for a different event, they recreated it as a Rio Grande Southern engine and repainted it, and it just still has its Rio Grande Southern paint job on it, which makes it even more interesting, I think.
I like it.
They call that the Sunrise Herald. But this is it's just one of the regular engines, the only K27 that they're operating here on the Cumbres and Toltec. But what a beautiful engine.
Oh, it is.
That's why I have 2 models of it.
Oh.
And speaking of the Rio Grande Southern, here is Rio Grande Southern number 20.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is an interesting locomotive.
It is.
It was running on the Rio Grande Southern right up to the very end of the Rio Grande Southern, and Robert Richardson ended up with it at the Narrow Gauge Motel just up the street from here in Alamosa, and it just sort of got abandoned on his property, and so he ended up with it.
Oh, really?
Well, he bought a bunch of Denver and Rio Grande equipment, and it had to be hauled over a small part of the Rio Grande Southern, and they said, you got to use one of our engines to do it, so they used this to haul the other over to the motel, and at the end of the day, it just ended up staying at the motel.
Really?
We have Richardson's whole story about that on tape. It's very interesting. Anyway, it was brought here by the Colorado Railroad Museum, who's done the restoration on it, and they only had one trailer, so first they brought the locomotive, and then they disappeared with the trailer, and they went and got into the tender, and they brought that back. But they just barely finished the restoration on this.
That's cool.
It has taken decades to get this locomotive running. And there's the tender with the Sunrise Herald on it.
That's neat.
Now, if you don't know, the Colorado Railroad Museum effectively is the old narrow gauge motel. Richardson moved the motel to Golden, Colorado, and then it just became the Colorado Railroad Museum. And they added a whole bunch of other stuff to the collection. But this has always been part of Richardson's collection, again, just because the Rio Grande Southern sort of abandoned it on his property.
I wish somebody'd leave us one.
Wouldn't that be neat? Because that is a beautiful...
That's cool.
If I had to pick the most beautiful locomotive on the narrow gauge, I might just pick that one. Now, both of these Rio Grande Southern locomotives are wearing their World War II paint jobs.
Oh.
The Defense Supplies Corporation seized the assets of the Rio Grande Southern and then leased it all back to them. The railroad operated in bankruptcy for its entire history.
Oh, dear.
And then during World War II, the Defense Department wanted to make sure that the stuff that needed to be operated was operated, and then the stuff that didn't need to be operated was scrapped out for the war effort, and so on. So anyway, both of these locomotives that are painted Rio Grande Southern are wearing their paint jobs from World War II.
That is awesome.
That's neat. Now, this is also the locomotive that was recreated in wood, which is on display in the park in Durango. It was used in a movie, Ticket to Tomahawk.
Oh.
And it was dressed up as a much earlier locomotive. And they needed to have one of those that they could take apart and load onto wagons as a movie prop. And so they built an exact reproduction of this locomotive entirely out of wood. And that is on display in the park there in Durango.
Oh, wow.
Where the 315 used to sit. So... anyway, I would like to see that wood locomotive put in the museum on the Durango and Silverton.
Yes.
Because it's a wood locomotive and it shouldn't be out in anything even vaguely like the elements. Anyway, what a beautiful engine. Again, really a high stepper, big drivers, very much like the T12 that's here. I first saw this locomotive when it was on display in Golden in, I think, 1984.
Wow.
And it was just kind of sitting there, certainly not in operational condition or anything, and people didn't think it ever would be operational again. It was just a beautiful locomotive parked out there in the sun. But over time, people said, I think that could be rebuilt. And it was not an easy rebuild.
Oh, I can imagine.
It turned out that it had a tremendous amount wrong with it, and the museum worked on it for a couple of decades, and then they finally had to send it off to Pennsylvania.
Oh.
And have the big shop there rebuild the running gear and put new tires on the wheels and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's back to its original condition as it left the Schenectady Locomotive Works in 1899.
Well, I like it. It reminds me of number 40, the ghost train of Old Ely. It looks like it could be a brother.
It is. It's like it's a miniature cousin.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same basic configuration. A different company built it and everything, but they're both high-stepping 10-wheelers.
Oh, okay, because, boy, it sure reminds me of the ghost train.
Boy, though, and two of our favorites.
Yes.
Anyway, they brought it here. It's never been on a real railroad until now. This is their first opportunity. So they took this train, just empty, no passengers, out to Bighorn and back just to test it. And then after the event, they started selling some tickets and took people on rides. But as it was never planned to be part of the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives, there was no scheduled trains, just test trains running number 20 here.
Right. really enjoy just watching them work on the engines, backing them in and out, and maneuvering them around.
This is a fun process here, and I mean, I don't know how many people would get a big kick out of it, but we do.
I do. It brings back other memories for me because they're dumping ashes, and I grew up around coal and wood stoves, and I know the process.
Well, your house was heated with coal.
Yeah, and so this was part of the routine. It's just different to see them do this with a locomotive.
With a locomotive.
Yeah.
And you've got to clean the grates off.
Yeah.
There's a lot of expended coal and ash and cinder that needs to be removed from the firebox, and there's a handle here that rakes a mechanism back and forth across the grates and scrapes all of the chunky cinders stuff, the cinders down into an ash pit. I'm going to build an ash pit on the 20th scale railroad.
Oh my goodness, yeah, you've got to have one of those.
Well, again, a lot of people might not get a kick out of shopping locomotives, but our entire railroad is nothing but a locomotive shop.
Right.
We don't have a main line, we just have a locomotive shop.
I like the shop.
Well, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's really neat, and I just love watching the process here of cleaning out the firebox. And then look at the smoke that creates.
Oh, no kidding. It does. As they're getting the draft for the fire, yeah, and there's the fire coming out, the ashes.
Anyway, they noticed you filming this.
Yes. The guys that come around on the other side, and you can see the fire and the ash pit. And I'm like, oh, cool.
Oh, wonderful. I think, they get a big kick out of some people who actually take a great interest in them just doing routine maintenance on the locomotive.
Right. Like I say, this brings back such memories when I was a kid and we had our stoves.
Yeah.
The same thing.
But to me, working on the engines is the most interesting thing. Once it's out on the main line, that's nice. But these scenes in and around the locomotive shop,
yep,
that's what really excites me.
I love it.
Well, we sure had a lot of fun with these, dare I say, modern locomotives.
Yes.
But compared to the earlier ones, definitely modern locomotives. But just beautiful to see them out here on the line.
Oh, I enjoyed it.
Well, at this point, they packed the entire show up and moved it over to Chama, New Mexico.
Right.
And so next week's show will be from Chama, New Mexico.
We'll be packing our show up and going over there, too.
We're going to be heading over there, too. But as a going-away present, God gave us this wonderful light and this beautiful, beautiful rainbow.
Man.
And what a great way to finish up our time in Antineto, Colorado. Well, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, all is not lost, because you can click on the blue button right here. The blue button.
There it is.
Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.